So this is part 3 of the Unit 4 review. We'll start with expanding democracy, and you'll recall this is a very important aspect of this time period, 1800 to 1848. We begin with maybe the most obvious thing, which is the expansion of the electorate. Suffrage is granted not only to property owners, but it now extended to all adult white males, whether or not they own property. So by the 1820s, 1830s, most states have expanded the electorate in that way by dropping any other qualifications. So all white male adults can vote. That's one thing. We see also in this time period the development of a second political party system, and some argued for its necessity. Parties are a good thing, going against what Washington said, and let's agree Washington probably didn't have all the answers for the 1820s and 1830s. You can have your own opinion on that. But some, like future President Martin Van Buren, protege, close confidant of Andrew Jackson, said the political party system is very healthy for our democracy. It means we won't split into North and South. We won't go by region. We're going by political party, and that's less dangerous. So anyway, so that you know, and after a couple of fits and starts during the 1820s, we end up in the 1830s with the Jackson Democrats, or Jacksonian Democrats, or simply Democrats. Oh, that's fine. And a new party, the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. The Whig Party mostly stands for things that Andrew Jackson is against. So, two-party system. We see also the opening up of political campaigning. A great example is William Henry Harrison. Never would have campaigned like that earlier. The log cabin campaign, the whiskey being given out, or the hard cider, that mode of popular campaigning became sort of the norm, regardless of whether the candidate was a common man or ordinary person, so to speak, or not. That became the way to go. And Jackson, of course, considered himself a defender of the common man and the ordinary person. Against whom? Against the Eastern elites. That leads me to remind you that you can't understand the expansion of democracy in the United States without linking it to territorial expansion in the West. It's really pressures from the West, their own interests, their own needs, their own ideas that are pushing on opening up democracy. And this is, of course, only a first step, but at the time, it's a big first step. Many other things play into expanding democracy. Social reform movements, the Second Great Awakening. We'll get to where it's hard to tell. We're pretty much at what is driving what. Is it the new expanded democracy that's leading social reform? Or is social reform contributing to expanding democracy? It certainly is a more democratic atmosphere, even for those groups that aren't permitted direct participation in politics in the United States at this time. This leads us directly into Andrew Jackson and his use of federal power as president. Remember, he's elected in 1828, defeating, for real this time, John Quincy Adams, and drawing on his popularity as a common person with common interests and needs, and defender of ordinary people against the elites. Remember, that's really what drives Andrew Jackson. He was around during the Revolution. He was a young teenager, but certainly he's from that group that believes the Union is sacred. The Union must stay together. So how does that affect the way he uses federal power? Well, one of the things we know, first off, is he plans to appoint a number of his supporters into federal government jobs. So some people had been holding on to their jobs since the early 1800s. By 1828, 1830, 1832, he's got many out and put in his own supporters. That is known as the spoils system, and Jackson considered it a democratic improvement over the way it was, where people held on to the jobs forever. Spoils system. Now, he only actually removes and replaces about 10% of those federal government workers, but this idea begins with him, that president's part of the job, maybe a good part of it will be to appoint people to positions, to reward them, and so on. The role of the federal government in society with Andrew Jackson, it depends, is the only way to look at this. The best way to look at Jackson, I think I've said before, is this dichotomy, this line in the sand, if you will, between East and West, where the Eastern elites he considers to be thieves and snobs and too well educated for their own good, and so on and so forth. And he really despises them for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, he does that. Remember, he makes his home in Nashville, Tennessee, pretty far to the western edge at that time. What about some of the issues that come up during his time period? Tariffs. Tariffs lead, of course, to the issue of nullification, which must be addressed. Jackson didn't feel strongly, actually, one way or the other, about tariffs. Note, he's a Westerner more than a Southerner. So that's not quite it's not clear yet where Westerners are going to stand on things such as tariffs, Westerners as a group, and maybe they will no longer exist as a group. Maybe they will simply become part of the North or the South. But at this time, there's a sort of third group, Westerners. So not feel particularly strongly about tariffs. Certainly, his vice president, John Calhoun of South Carolina, felt very strongly. And when tariffs were put on manufacturers that were made, if the North made similar products, tariffs were put, a tax on imports, were put on those products that were similar, that were made abroad and might have been cheaper, but for the tariff. So the Nullification Doctrine, John Calhoun, Jackson's own vice president, by 1828, it was already called the Tariff of Abominations. By 1832, Congress goes to raise tariffs even higher, and that's when we get the enunciation of this doctrine that any state that considers a law unconstitutional can declare it null and void and does not have to obey it. Of course, that's a very dangerous principle for a union. Jackson is for the union. He doesn't want anything to pull it apart, and that's where he'll stand on that. He's a union man, if you will, from back in the day of the revolution and so on. Internal improvements, by the way, tariffs, internal improvements, and the National Bank, don't forget together, that's the Whig, or earlier than that, even National Republican, but truly Whig program, the American system, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, two of the most notable proponents. What about internal improvements? Well, Jackson sometimes said no and sometimes said yes. He vetoed or he signed those bills about internal improvements. Seemed to be more on personal preference. The bank is a different matter. He hated the bank and went to great lengths to destroy it, which is really what happens. And that leads to a lot of problems with the American economy as deposits made previously to the National Bank now are going to state banks, which Jackson has indicated can accept money from that belongs to the federal government. So these end up being called his pet banks, that he indicates that, yeah, that state bank, and that one will be receiving the federal deposit. He aims to destroy it. He hates its president or chairman, Nicholas Biddle. He just reeks of Eastern elite. They hate each other, I'm sure, equally. One thing that must also be mentioned with Andrew Jackson, of course, there's much more, but Indian removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by Jackson, ends with, more or less, the Trail of Tears by the mid-late 1830s, where thousands of Indians are removed to what is then called Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. Today, we call it Oklahoma. That's where they go. That's where they're sent. They don't want to go. There's about 5 tribes involved and had their own societies and civilizations, were settled, did agriculture, everything. But of course, as you know, Europeans in Georgia, Americans in Georgia wanted that rich land in northeast Georgia, and we're set to take it regardless. So Indian removal is leading to also an expansion of the West, which Jackson was not against, not at all. As a Westerner, he would like that. The only moment, I suppose, where he doesn't go for the West and expansion is not annexing Texas when it requests annexation in 1835 or 36, having declared independence from Mexico. But he's more concerned with the Union at that point. Annexing Texas might break the Union apart over the question of slavery and should it be in the new territory. It certainly would open a can of worms, and Jackson wanted to avoid that. See you for part 4.